There is a photo that has circulated online for years. It shows nothing dangerous, no creature, no storm, no wreckage, just open water, shot from above, looking straight down, dark blue fading into black. No bottom visible, no edges, nothing, and people cannot look at it. Not for long anyway. Something about it produces a reaction that is difficult to describe and almost impossible to override. A tightening, a need to scroll past, a feeling that sits somewhere between discomfort and genuine dread, arriving before any thought has formed about why. This is thalassophobia, the fear of deep water, and it is one of the strangest, most revealing fears in all of human psychology. Not because it is rare, because it is everywhere. Researchers have documented it across every culture they have studied, in people who have never seen the ocean, in children who have never been near open water, in experienced divers who have spent thousands of hours beneath the surface and still describe moments of sudden overwhelming unease when they look down and see nothing beneath them. No prior trauma required, no bad experience, no reason, just depth, just darkness, just the absence of a bottom. And that is exactly what makes it so hard to explain, because this is not a fear of something. It is a fear of nothing, of open space, of invisible depth, of a world the brain cannot read, or map, or make sense of. On land, the brain is constantly working, scanning edges, measuring distance, tracking movement, building a picture of what is safe and what is not. It does this every second without effort. The deep ocean shuts all of that down at once. Color is gone within the first few meters. Sound warps in ways the brain cannot interpret. Scale becomes impossible to judge. And beyond a certain depth, there is simply nothing. No light, no information, no reference point for miles in every direction. When the brain goes dark like that, it does not stay quiet. It starts producing something, and what it produces is almost always worse than anything actually living down there. So what is the nervous system actually detecting? Why does the sight of deep water trigger the same ancient alarm system as a predator in the dark? And why can knowing all of this, understanding it completely, still not make the feeling go away? In this video, we explore why that feeling exists, and what the mind is actually responding to when the ocean offers nothing in return. And before we begin, I'm curious, do you feel this when you look into deep water, or do you know someone who does? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy calm, immersive science like this, a like and subscribe helps this channel reach more people who are drawn to these kinds of mysteries. Now let's begin. It begins with orientation. With the simple act of looking across water, the horizon holds everything in place. A line the mind can rest against, a boundary that quietly confirms the world is still structured. But when the gaze turns downward, that structure dissolves. There is no edge to follow, no surface to measure against, only a gradual fall into color that deepens until it disappears entirely. The brain reaches for a floor that never arrives. It anticipates resistance, a visible end, something to anchor distance, and finds nothing in return. Early laboratory observations noted this exact response, a subtle spike in tension when subjects were shown images lacking depth cues, even when they knew the images were safe. Screens do not soften the effect. The visual system processes depth before context, translating gradients and shadows into space. Even a flat image can open into something vast, and the mind reacts as if the fall were real. Every waking moment, the brain constructs a quiet geometry of the world. It traces outlines, measures gaps, compares distances, and anchors the body within a stable frame of reference. Walls, horizons, textures underfoot, even the subtle shift of light across surfaces all contribute to a continuous internal map that rarely draws attention to itself. Beneath open water, that map begins to dissolve. Edges vanish first, then distance loses coherence, and boundaries no longer hold their shape. Without fixed points, the brain cannot triangulate position or scale, and spatial awareness starts to loosen, as if its coordinates have been gently erased. Neural systems responsible for orientation continue searching, cycling through expectations that are never fulfilled. This mismatch between prediction and perception creates a low, persistent signal of error. It emerges before language, before reasoning, as a quiet disruption in the body's sense of place, where direction exists but no longer leads anywhere. Numbers can stretch endlessly on a page, yet physical space is expected to resolve. The mind tolerates vastness when it can still imagine an endpoint, a distant boundary that exists even if it remains unseen. Depth, in this sense, is something that can be measured, extended, and eventually completed. But the idea of no bottom resists that framework. It offers distance without conclusion, a vertical expanse that does not promise arrival. The distinction is subtle yet significant. The difference between something far away and something that does not end at all. One can be pictured, the other slips beyond representation. Cognitive models rely on limits to stabilize perception. When those limits disappear, the brain continues projecting downward, searching for closure that never forms. This ongoing extension creates a quiet tension, not tied to any object or event, but to the absence of finality itself, where space remains open and unresolved without ever settling into form. Perception is never passive. It is an active construction unfolding moment by moment. The visual system does not simply receive the world, it predicts it, layering expectation over incoming signals to create a stable experience. In familiar environments, this process remains invisible, seamlessly correcting gaps and smoothing uncertainty into coherence. In open depth, that same mechanism continues without guidance. With little sensory input to constrain it, the brain begins extending possibilities into the empty field. Subtle variations in light or color become suggestions, faint cues that are amplified into potential forms. Pattern recognition, usually precise, starts to overreach, interpreting randomness as structure. Motion is especially anticipated. The nervous system is tuned to detect even the smallest shift, a survival trait carried across time. When no clear movement is present, the expectation itself persists, creating the impression that something may be there, just beyond resolution, where absence quietly transforms into a kind of presence that cannot be confirmed or dismissed. There are moments when the surface becomes almost perfectly still, as if the ocean has paused its motion entirely. In rough conditions, movement provides constant signals. Waves rise and fall, reflections shift, and the body receives a steady stream of information about orientation and change. Even without noticing, the mind reads this activity and remains quietly calibrated to its surroundings. When that motion fades, the feedback disappears with it. The water no longer offers patterns to follow or changes to track, leaving the senses with very little to interpret. Sound softens, visual cues flatten, and the environment begins to feel suspended rather than active. In this absence, the brain continues its search for input, scanning for variation that never arrives. Stillness becomes a kind of signal in itself, not through presence, but through what is missing. With nothing shifting or responding, perception stretches into the quiet, where the lack of information subtly reshapes how space is experienced. A few steps can carry the shoreline into sudden absence, where the seabed ends without warning. What was once textured and knowable falls away into open depth, and the transition happens all at once, not gradually, but as a clean divide between the visible and the unformed. Divers often describe this boundary in precise terms, a line where color, detail, and structure hold steady, then vanish beyond a sharp edge. Instruments confirm the change, yet the body registers it first, a subtle shift as familiar cues disappear and are replaced by an unmarked descent. The visual system attempts to follow the terrain downward, expecting continuity, but finds only a drop that offers no intermediate steps. This abrupt loss of reference interrupts spatial processing more intensely than gradual depth, creating a concentrated moment where perception recalibrates without guidance, and the environment seems to open beneath itself, without transition or warning. Buoyancy holds the body in place, suspended rather than supported, with no contact beneath to define position. In shallow water, the ground provides a constant reference, a quiet reassurance that orientation remains stable. When that reference disappears, the body drifts without a fixed frame, and up and down begin to lose their certainty. Vision offers little correction. Without a visible bottom, there is no stable plane to anchor depth or distance, only a uniform field that shifts with each movement. The inner ear continues its work, tracking balance and motion, yet without external confirmation, its signals become less reliable, creating a subtle disconnect between sensation and perception. Small adjustments in posture can feel exaggerated, as if the body is moving through a space that does not fully respond. The absence of grounding transforms floating into something less defined, where position is maintained but no longer clearly understood within the surrounding environment. Light does not vanish all at once. It withdraws in stages, each layer of depth quietly taking something with it. The first change is subtle, a soft dimming that narrows contrast and flattens detail. Colors begin to fade in sequence, longer wavelengths disappearing first until reds dissolve, then oranges, leaving a cooler, reduced spectrum behind. As depth increases, visibility contracts, edges lose definition, textures soften, and the distance between objects becomes harder to judge. The environment grows less distinct, not through obstruction, but through gradual subtraction, as if information is being filtered away rather than blocked. The visual system continues to interpret what remains, adjusting sensitivity to compensate, yet each adjustment comes with less data to work from. What was once clear becomes ambiguous, and the surrounding space shifts from a readable scene into something more uniform, where forms persist but their boundaries no longer fully resolve within the fading light. Beyond a certain depth, illumination does not fade further, it simply ceases. The remaining traces of light are absorbed, leaving an environment where vision no longer extends outward, but folds inward, limited to what the body can produce or carry with it. In this absence, the visual system reaches a boundary it was never designed to cross. Human sight depends on reflected light, on contrast and variation, and without these elements, perception cannot form an image of the surrounding space. There is no horizon, no texture, no distant reference, only a uniform darkness that offers nothing to resolve. Other senses continue, yet they cannot fully replace what vision provides. Orientation becomes internal rather than environmental, guided by balance and motion instead of sight. The mind adapts as it can, but this setting lies outside the conditions under which human perception evolved, where seeing no longer connects the observer to the world around them. Motion persists even where light does not, carried through water in ways that remain largely hidden from view. In deeper regions, movement tends to slow, shaped by pressure, temperature, and limited energy, resulting in a quiet, deliberate rhythm rather than sudden bursts or rapid change. Without clear visual confirmation, the brain relies on indirect signals, subtle shifts in surrounding particles, faint disturbances in the water, or slight changes in pressure can suggest activity without revealing its source. These cues are often incomplete, forming fragments rather than coherent images. The nervous system is tuned to detect motion as a priority, yet here it receives only partial information. Instead of a defined form moving through space, there is the sense of motion itself, detached from any visible body. This separation alters perception, where movement becomes less about what is seen and more about what is inferred, existing just beyond clarity, present but not fully resolved. Imagination does not wait for complete information. It begins working with whatever is available, extending fragments into possibilities. In environments where input is limited, this process becomes more active, drawing from memory, pattern, and expectation to complete what cannot be directly perceived. The brain is shaped by prediction, constantly modeling what might occur next. When sensory data is reduced, these models rely more heavily on internal assumptions, many of which are tuned toward detecting potential threats. This bias is not deliberate, but embedded within neural pathways that prioritize survival over accuracy. As a result, neutral or ambiguous signals can be interpreted as meaningful, even when no clear source exists. A slight change, a faint suggestion of form, or an incomplete pattern may be expanded into something more defined within the mind. These constructions are not errors in function, but expressions of a system designed to anticipate, where absence does not remain empty, and uncertainty is quietly filled with possibility. Sound moves through water with a different character, traveling faster and with less loss than it does through air. Vibrations carry across distance in ways that feel both immediate and diffuse, reaching the body before they can be clearly located or interpreted. Direction becomes difficult to resolve. Without the usual differences in timing and intensity between the ears, the brain struggles to triangulate where a sound originates. A distant source can seem close, while something nearby may feel strangely displaced, as if it exists outside normal spatial logic. The result is a soundscape that resists clear mapping. Echoes blur into continuous tones, and discrete noises stretch into elongated impressions that lack sharp boundaries. The auditory system continues its search for patterns and positions, yet the cues it relies on are altered. Within this shifting field, sound no longer anchors space as it does on land, and the environment becomes harder to organize through hearing alone. Size relies on comparison, on surrounding cues that quietly define proportion without drawing attention to themselves. On land, these cues are constant, familiar objects, textured surfaces, and layered distances that allow the brain to estimate how large or far something might be. In open water, those references begin to disappear. Without nearby objects to anchor perception, distance stretches without clear markers, and scale becomes detached from certainty. A shape may appear suspended at one distance, yet its true position remains unclear, shifting subtly as the viewer moves. Light and clarity add to the ambiguity. Objects can seem larger or smaller depending on how they are illuminated or how much detail reaches the eye. The brain attempts to reconcile these signals, but without reliable context, its calculations remain incomplete. What remains is a space where proportion no longer settles, and where size exists as an impression rather than a fixed measurement within the surrounding environment. Pressure accumulates quietly, layer by layer, as depth increases, shaping the environment in ways that are rarely visible yet constantly present. Each descent adds weight to the surrounding water, compressing space itself into a denser, more resistant medium that alters how movement and sensation are experienced. The body is often shielded from directly feeling these changes, especially near the surface, yet subtle signals still reach the nervous system. Breathing shifts slightly, motion requires more effort, and the surrounding water responds differently to even small actions. These changes are not always consciously noticed, but they are registered. Within this environment, perception adjusts to conditions that differ from those on land. The brain integrates these cues alongside others, forming an internal sense that the space is not entirely familiar. This awareness does not rely on clear sensation, but on accumulation, where the unseen properties of depth quietly influence how the environment is interpreted. Two vast environments share a similar absence of familiar structure, yet they are experienced in very different ways. Both remove the usual cues that define position and scale, both extend beyond ordinary perception, and both exist largely outside direct human reach. In each, the mind encounters space that resists easy interpretation. The difference lies in proximity. The ocean surrounds the body directly, pressing in from all sides, while space remains separated by layers of atmosphere and distance. Water conducts sensation, carrying movement, pressure, and sound through the body in a continuous exchange that feels immediate rather than distant. This closeness changes how the environment is processed. The ocean is not observed from afar but entered, experienced from within rather than viewed across a boundary. The brain responds differently to spaces that envelop it, especially when those spaces offer limited clarity, creating a more immediate interaction between perception and the unknown. The surface often appears gentle, a thin boundary where light rests and motion feels familiar. Ripples move in slow patterns, reflections shimmer softly, and the world above seems to remain intact, as if nothing beneath could disrupt that calm continuity. Yet this layer is only a narrow transition, separating two very different environments. Just below, conditions change rapidly, depth increases, light diminishes, and structure dissolves into forms that no longer resemble what exists above. The contrast is not always visible from the surface itself, creating a sense of stability that does not extend downward. Perception tends to rely on immediate surroundings, and the surface provides enough familiar cues to suggest safety. The mind reads what is present and fills in what is not, assuming continuity where none exists. This creates an illusion, not through deception, but through limitation, where a calm exterior masks the vast and shifting conditions that begin just beneath it. Accounts from experienced divers often describe a shift that arrives without warning, even after years of familiarity. The surroundings remain technically unchanged, equipment functions as expected, and yet something in perception alters as attention drifts downward into open water. Many describe moments when the usual clarity of orientation softens, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. The body continues its movements with precision, but awareness becomes more diffuse, as if the space beneath no longer offers the same continuity it did moments before. Training provides structure, yet it does not fully override this response. These reports appear across varying conditions, from clear tropical waters to deeper, less illuminated regions, suggesting a consistent underlying mechanism rather than isolated circumstance. The experience is often brief, passing as focus returns to immediate tasks, but it leaves a distinct impression, a reminder that even within controlled environments, perception can shift in ways that are subtle yet deeply felt. Far below the surface, beyond the reach of ordinary exploration, the seafloor descends into regions that extend far deeper than most landscapes on Earth rise above it. The Mariana Trench stands as the most prominent of these places, a vast depression stretching across the ocean floor, its deepest point reaching nearly 11,000 meters below sea level. At such depths, familiar comparisons begin to lose meaning. Mountains could be placed within this space and still remain submerged, yet the scale is difficult to internalize without reference. Distance becomes an abstract measure rather than a tangible one, existing beyond direct experience. Despite its remoteness, this environment continues to draw attention, not through visibility, but through what it represents. It marks a boundary of exploration, a region where conditions are extreme and access remains limited. Within this depth, the ocean reveals itself not as a uniform expanse, but as a layered world extending far beyond what is typically imagined. In regions where light never reaches, life continues through pathways that do not depend on the sun. Instead of photosynthesis, many deep-sea ecosystems rely on chemical energy drawn from compounds released through hydrothermal vents and cold seeps along the ocean floor. Here, microorganisms form the foundation of entire communities, converting chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide into usable energy. This process supports more complex organisms, creating networks of life that function independently from surface conditions. Tubeworms, crustaceans, and other species cluster around these sources, forming dense assemblages in otherwise sparse surroundings. Without sunlight, visual signals play a reduced role, and other adaptations take precedence. Sensory systems evolve to detect pressure, vibration, and chemical gradients, allowing organisms to navigate and interact within their environment. These ecosystems demonstrate that life can persist under conditions far removed from those typically associated with habitability, expanding the known boundaries of where and how living systems can exist. In the absence of sunlight, some organisms generate their own illumination, producing light through internal chemical reactions that unfold quietly within their bodies. This process, known as bioluminescence, emerges in pulses, glows, and brief flashes, each variation serving a specific function within the surrounding darkness. Patterns appear where none are expected, points of light drifting, fading, then returning in altered forms. These signals can attract, communicate, or conceal, depending on how they are shaped and timed. Some remain constant, others flicker with irregular rhythm, creating sequences that do not align with familiar sources of light. The visual system, accustomed to illumination from above, encounters something different here, light originating from within the environment itself. Without a clear source or direction, these emissions resist easy interpretation, appearing suspended rather than anchored. In this setting, light no longer defines space in predictable ways, and the boundary between object and illumination becomes less distinct, blending presence and signal into a single expression. Much of the ocean remains beyond direct observation, not because it is unreachable in theory, but because access is limited by conditions that challenge even the most advanced tools. Depth, pressure, and distance combine to create an environment where exploration progresses slowly, often in brief, carefully controlled intervals. Mapping technologies provide outlines, revealing large-scale structures across the seafloor, yet fine detail is still missing in many regions. Large areas remain only partially surveyed, their features inferred rather than directly seen. Within these spaces, biological communities continue to exist with minimal documentation, their diversity suggested through occasional encounters. Equipment must withstand extremes that restrict duration and mobility, limiting how long researchers can remain and how far they can travel in a single mission. Each descent offers only a fragment of the larger picture. As a result, the ocean holds extensive regions that are known in outline but not in detail, where presence is acknowledged, yet understanding remains incomplete. Long before environments were measured or mapped, survival depended on interpreting incomplete information. The human nervous system evolved within conditions where uncertainty often carried consequence, shaping responses that favored caution when clarity was limited or absent. This tendency remains embedded in perception. When sensory input is reduced or ambiguous, the brain does not remain neutral. It leans toward interpretations that prioritize potential risk. This bias operates beneath conscious awareness, influencing how space and possibility are evaluated even in the absence of direct evidence. Uncertainty becomes a signal in itself, not because it contains inherent threat, but because it lacks confirmation of safety. The mind responds by widening its range of possible outcomes, weighting them toward what requires attention. In this way, the unknown is not treated as empty, but as open, a space where multiple possibilities coexist, and where perception adjusts by preparing for more than what is immediately present. Not every mind interprets the same environment in the same way, even when the physical conditions are identical. Subtle differences in sensory processing shape how information is filtered, amplified, or reduced, influencing how space is experienced at a fundamental level. Some individuals maintain a stronger sensitivity to incomplete or ambiguous input, detecting variations that others may not consciously register. This heightened awareness can extend to environments where cues are limited, allowing small changes to carry more weight within perception. Internal states also play a role. Variations in baseline arousal, attention, and prior experience influence how signals are prioritized and interpreted. In conditions where clarity is reduced, these internal factors become more prominent, guiding the brain's response in the absence of strong external reference. As a result, the same open depth may be processed differently across individuals, not because the environment changes, but because the systems interpreting it operate with varying thresholds and sensitivities. Attention often lingers on what cannot be fully resolved, returning to images and ideas that resist clear interpretation. The same qualities that create uncertainty can also sustain interest, drawing the mind back to environments that remain partially understood. Curiosity emerges from this balance. When something is unfamiliar yet not overwhelming, it holds a space where exploration can occur without immediate resolution. The deep ocean occupies this space, offering glimpses of structure and life while preserving vast areas that remain unseen. Repeated exposure can shift perception, allowing the initial response to settle into a quieter form of engagement. Details become more noticeable, patterns more recognizable, and the environment begins to reveal layers that were not apparent at first encounter. In this process, the unknown does not disappear. It changes character, becoming something that invites observation rather than closure, where absence continues to exist, but is approached with a different kind of attention. Over time, repeated contact with the same environment begins to alter how it is interpreted. What first appeared uncertain gradually gains structure, not because the surroundings have changed, but because the brain refines its internal models through experience. With continued exposure, sensory cues that once felt incomplete become more recognizable. Subtle variations in light, motion, and sound start to form patterns, allowing perception to stabilize where it previously searched without resolution. Training accelerates this process. providing frameworks that guide attention and interpretation within conditions that might otherwise remain ambiguous. Adaptation does not remove the underlying characteristics of the environment, but it shifts how they are processed. The nervous system becomes more efficient at filtering relevant signals from background noise, reducing the need to rely on broad, precautionary responses. As familiarity grows, the same depth that once lacked clarity begins to feel more defined, not fully known, but no longer entirely unstructured within perception. Across continents, most landscapes have been surveyed, mapped, and revisited until their features are widely documented and understood. Paths have been traced, elevations measured, and boundaries defined, creating a sense that the surface of the land, while vast, is largely known in its structure. Beneath the ocean, that completeness does not exist. Large regions remain only partially explored, their contours outlined in broad forms but lacking the fine detail that brings a place fully into view. Movement through these areas is limited, and each observation reveals only a small portion of a much larger expanse. This contrast places the ocean among the last environments where discovery still unfolds at a fundamental level, not simply in rare findings, but in the ongoing process of revealing what is already there, yet not fully seen. Within this space, the world remains open in a different way, where presence is certain, but understanding continues to develop with each new descent. Even with advancing tools and expanding data, certain aspects of the ocean remain only partially understood, not from lack of effort, but from the complexity of the systems involved. Processes unfold across scales that are difficult to observe continuously, from microscopic interactions to vast shifting currents that evolve over time. Some patterns are recognized but not fully explained, appearing consistently without a complete model to describe their origin or behavior. Biological adaptations emerge that function effectively within extreme conditions, yet their underlying mechanisms are still being studied in detail. Technological limits also shape understanding. Instruments can capture snapshots, but continuous observation across depth and distance remains challenging, leaving gaps between what is recorded and what occurs in between. Within these gaps, interpretation continues to develop, guided by evidence that is often incomplete. The ocean presents a layered system where knowledge expands steadily, yet certain processes remain open, not as mysteries without direction, but as areas where explanation is still forming. The image returns quietly, unchanged in its simplicity, a view into open water where depth reveals itself without detail or boundary. Nothing within it has shifted, yet the way it is seen now carries the weight of everything that has been explored. The mind can trace the processes behind the reaction, the loss of reference, the way perception adapts, the subtle signals that reshape understanding in the absence of clarity. Each layer adds context, forming a structure around what once appeared undefined. And still, the image remains as it was, offering no additional information, no new cues to resolve its depth. The knowledge does not replace the experience, it moves alongside it, existing as a parallel understanding rather than a substitute. What emerges is a balance where explanation and perception coexist, one providing insight, the other continuing without resolution, allowing the original impression to remain present, quiet, and unchanged beneath everything now understood. Gradually, the ocean settles into something more than a location, becoming an experience shaped as much by perception as by depth itself. What it evokes does not arise from any single feature, but from the way the mind meets an environment that offers little to hold onto and much to interpret. Across each layer, from surface to unseen distances, the response has remained consistent, a quiet interaction between uncertainty and understanding. The feeling that emerges is not separate from the observer, but part of a shared human process where the brain reaches outward and adapts to what it cannot fully resolve. In that sense, the ocean reflects something internal as well as external, revealing how perception continues even when clarity fades. As the image lingers, there is space to notice which moments remained most present, which details stayed with you. And from wherever you are watching, this experience continues to connect across distance, carried through attention, curiosity, and the quiet pull of the unknown.